So today my talk is going to be called Never Mind the Neuro-bollocks, and it is a beginner's guide to separating neuro-fact from neuro-trash. So I hope that in about 45 minutes time you will agree with me about some of this stuff. So as an outline, what I'm going to tell you about to begin with is about the brain in society, just to give a context of why it's important to know about the neuro-bollocks. Then I'll tell you a bit about the history. I'm not actually going to tell you about Egypt today because I've already done that in my Why Do We Know Less talk. But I will tell you about frogs' legs, and then I'll tell you about the many faces of neuro. Then I want to move into the substance of the talk, which is what we need to be careful of, and overconfidence of the scientists. And another type of animal, aquatic animal, comes in. We're going to see a dead salmon as well. And then finally I'm going to finish off with the misuse of neuro outside research, clinical practice and society. So that's a general overview. In terms of the brain in society, it's everywhere around us. So we have these brain trainers that are marketed to lots of people to presumably improve our brains, and you'll see what I think about those later on. Popular culture is now understanding how important the brain is, and more we have movies, books, etc. about things to do with brain-related disorders. So for example, the film Still Alice, where Suzanne Moore plays a professor of English whose language is breaking down because of Alzheimer's. In the UK, one of our beloved fantasy writers, Terry Pratchett, fought a battle with dementia, and that made a lot of people who didn't know anything about dementia get some sort of insight into this condition. Sport is now coming in on that, and this is because there's a growing understanding that repeated knocks to the head through contact sports such as American football result in lots of what we call micro lesions. So there's a small amount of brain damage which over time add up and result in a major problem later on in life. So rather than one big injury, it's many small injuries, and there's research that's shown that the brains of some ex-professional footballers, American footballers, looks like the brain of someone with Alzheimer's, and the cognitive disorders of memory problems, disorganization, etc. are there as well. So that's making sport rethink some things about whether people should be hitting one another, and certainly in the education system there are changes happening in the way that children are allowed to play sports and for example, heading the ball in football and things like that. Even politics, and politics around us everywhere, as we know. Politics is an example where we begin to understand some things about what's happening in the brain. So this is research that's quite old now, and it's American research which took people on the conservative or far right of the spectrum and people who are more liberal in their political views, and put them into a brain scanner and gave them certain tasks to do. I can't remember the exact specifics, but the tasks are ones that involve having some sort of appreciation of empathy and emotion towards other people. And what they found was that there were significant differences between these two groups, so the conservative and the liberal people, and the differences tended to be in the parts of the brain that deal with emotions and threat. So it seemed that even at this, even with politics, we can find some fundamental brain-related issues that result in the kinds of differences that we see in people's general behavior. And then of course, that might help us understand some of the things that we're seeing in certain aspects of politics all around the world. America is only one example. I know that There are similar debates happening in Brazil, through Europe, etc. And then finally, the thing that's effectively brought us together today, which is that I started giving these online talks in response to the COVID pandemic and the fact that we've got people who are suffering from the disorder, and there are some clues that, or suggestions that there are possibly brain-related problems happening. But these are very preliminary findings, and they need to be replicated a lot before anything else can happen. Okay, so that's giving you a context of the fact that things to do with the brain surround us everywhere, and that's why a better understanding of what's happening in the brain and not being gullible to some of the claims that are made is rather important. So looking into this, just as a fundamental basic understanding, everything starts with something called a neuron, which is basically a nerve cell which transmits information around the body. And we know that from about week 3 of development, so in utero, we are producing about 250,000 new neurons every minute. So there's this massive growth of these nerve cells in the growing embryo. And in total, they say that there are about 86 million neurons in the brain. And these things are doing everything for us in terms of helping us control our bodies, control our breathing, controlling the function of all the systems within our bodies, and also taking information in from the outside world to allow us to understand the outside world and interact with it. And the basis for a lot of the information that's happening and coordination is to do with what are called synapses, which are the junctions between neurons that allow one neuron from one area to pass information to another area. So it's like a relay station where two neurons meet. And at birth we have apparently 2,500 synapses, but these are growing constantly. As we grow even to a 3-year-old, we have all sorts of synapses in the brain, and then as we get to adulthood, we have thousands upon thousands of these synapses, and slowly what's happening is the brain is learning which connections are important for when you look at the world, when you hear the world, when you taste the world, etc. And it puts more effort into those and takes effort away from the ones that don't seem to be much use. So all the time the brain is doing a bit of housekeeping to try to be efficient, and recently we're learning that a lot of that housekeeping is actually happening while we sleep. So sleep isn't actually for physical rest, it's actually for the brain to do its sorting itself out. Okay, so that background was important because those neurons, they're the fundamental basis behind everything to do with the brain. And our first foray into understanding what's happened with an Italian called Galvani. Luigi Galvani found that he could make the muscles of a dead frog twitch when he touched them with different metals or passed a current from some sort of electric generator. So what we see in the diagram on the right is just frog's legs. So these are from a dead frog. They've been completely separated from the rest of the body. But he found that if he connected two different parts of this frog's legs, he could actually make it twitch. And if he passed some current from the top section, which is where the nerve cells are, he could actually make that frog's leg twitch. And that was the first signs that of what we call bioelectricity, which is the study of electrical patterns and the signals between tissues, such as nerves and muscles. So effectively, the way that our body works is by sending little electrical signals constantly through the brain, through the body, to allow us to do everything that we're doing. So me speaking to you right now is involving electricity. You listening to me is involving electricity. And so lots of electrical stimulation, activation, and electrical gathering is happening in your brain and your body right now to allow you to survive. Now, what I wanted to do was to tell you about the many faces of neuro, and part of this is because of a lot of misunderstanding about what this term neuro refers to. So I'm just going to give you a couple of definitions, and for some of you these definitions will not mean anything, or they won't matter at all, but for some of you it might help to understand some of the subtle but important differences. So psychology is the study of human behavior, basically all of it. How can you recognize me? How can you understand the language I'm speaking? Also, why do I get on with some people and not other people, which is not about my interaction with the world, but it's my interaction with another person. Then there's how am I in a group of people? Do I go quiet, or do I speak a lot when there's other people around? And how am I affected by the behavior of large groups of people? So all of that is psychology, all the way from how my vision works, all the way to how I'll function in a large group of people at a party. Cognitive psychology is the study of just the mental processes that we need for everyday life. So how our vision works, how our language, memory, face recognition, and our thinking processes. So importantly, cognitive psychology is the very beginnings of human behavior. It's not anything to do with how I interact with someone else. It's got nothing to do with whether I'm an optimistic person or a gregarious person or a shy person. It's certainly nothing to do with what my romantic relationships are like, and it's nothing to do with how I might be looking at your behavior, because cognitive psychology is simply the mental processes that I need for everyday life. They're nothing to do with how I interact with anyone else. Neuropsychology is the study of how brain structures and the processes of sending information from one place to another mediate any form of behavior. So that behavior is either cognitive behavior, or it can be anything to do with how I move my arm, or how my digestion works, how my appetite works. So all of that is neuropsychology, because it's how the brain structures and all of the various processes allow our day-to-day behavior. So cognitive neuropsychology is the study of individuals with brain damage to understand just the mental functions such as memory, language, and face recognition. So you'll have seen in my previous talks where I've talked about some of the patients that I've worked with who've got memory problems, or patients who've got problems with face recognition. And what I'm doing there is studying them to give us a unique window into how you and I function. So these people with brain damage who've lost these functions are actually serving as a really useful window into ourselves, but just at the cognitive level. So it's not anything more than trying to understand mental processes, and some of that work then also involves trying to develop better assessments for people. And in one of the talks, one of the early talks, I talked about dementia and some of the work that we're doing to try to develop a better test to diagnose dementia earlier than is currently possible. And in fact, that's going to be the subject of one of my subsequent talks. Now, moving on, neuropsychiatry is a branch of medicine that deals with mental disorders that we know are attributable to disease of the nervous system. So schizophrenia might be an example. That is a disorder of the nervous system, and it results in this particular problem called schizophrenia. And that is a realm of neuropsychiatry. I'm not a psychiatrist. I'm not a neuropsychiatrist. Neurosurgery is a medical speciality that's concerned with trying to prevent or diagnose or surgically treat and rehabilitate disorders which affect any portion of the nervous system. So if someone has intractable epilepsy that's greatly affecting their day-to-day life, they might have neurosurgery to reduce that epilepsy. Or if someone has a tumor that's in their brain that is causing major problems to their life, then neurosurgery would be for removing that. I'm not a neurosurgeon, and I've had friends who've known me for years who still think I'm a neurosurgeon. My salary is way less than a neurosurgeon. They do very different things. They are medical doctors who've specialized in this particular thing, and it's completely different from neuropsychology. Finally, neuroscience is a branch of the general life sciences that deals with the anatomy, physiology, biochemistry, or molecular biology of nerves and any nervous tissue, and especially in relation to behavior and learning. Now, that's a very, very broad definition, and that is appropriate. So neuroscience can be anything from the biochemistry happening in the nerve cells to the anatomy of how there are certain fiber tracts that go from the back of your head to the front of your head. So it's a very, very, very broad science, and often people assume that neuroscience and neuropsychology are one and the same thing, but they're not. So just as I'll come back to that in a moment, but to give you an idea of how we've moved from Galvani and his frogs, in 1880, another Italian, Angelo Mosso, he, in a non-invasive way, which means that he didn't cut anyone up, he measured the redistribution of blood while we're in an emotional state or while we're thinking about something. So he was one of the first people to understand that the blood starts moving differently around our body if we're emotional or we're thinking about something. Then in the early 1900s, something called pneumoencephalography was developed. And this is a complex process, and I'm not going to go into it, but the reason I mention it is because it was one of the very early attempts at looking at the physical density of the brain. So it's kind of like an X-ray. So it was a very, very, very early form of X-ray. And then in the 1970s and 1980s, that's when we had this massive explosion in what's known as neuroimaging, where procedures such as magnetic resonance imaging, or MRI scan, or computerized tomography, a CT scan, were developed, and these were developed for assessing physical damage. So this is if someone has got a physical brain damage or a tumor or something like that. Then other forms known as SPECT and PET, and I'm not going to go into the details, but they were developed to look at function. So these weren't like the X-rays which were showing physicality, they were more about how are things functioning. These two were combined at some level to create something known as fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging, which is a way of looking at how different parts of the brain are doing things, are functioning while we're doing an activity. And it's important to know that because I'm going to come back to that later on with our salmon. Nowadays, we've got a whole host of different techniques: EEG, ERP, MEG, TMS, TDCS, and the alphabet soup of letters keeps going. And virtually every year or every 2 years, there's another format using slightly different techniques, etc. So there's just been this enormous exponential increase in the number of techniques of looking at the human brain ever since Galvani started playing with his frog's legs. So neuroimaging is vast. An example here is an MRI scan of my patient David, who had suffered from major brain hemorrhage which nearly killed him, and the white that you see at the back of his head on the left hand side is the area of brain damage that he suffered because of his brain hemorrhage. So that's an MRI scan. This is a photograph of me looking like I'm having my nails and hair done, but I'm not actually having my nails and hair done. I'm having an MEG scan. So an MEG scan is an extremely complex set of magnets that are in that big beehive that looks like it's drying my hair, that is picking up the little magnetic signals that are all around my head all the time, because there are nerve impulses going around all of the time. There's magnetism all around us, and that beehive is picking up all those little magnetic fields to try to make sense of what's happening within my brain. And as an example, this is data that I collected in a collaboration many years ago between people who are called synesthetes, and I bet some of you are synesthetes. So if you've ever thought that days of the week have color, or numbers have got color, or words taste of things, or music has got a color, you're a synesthete. So synesthesia is a multi-sensory perception. So whereas you and I will look at these letters and we'll see letters all in black, a synesthete will see these letters, they'll read the letters, but they'll also see a color in their mind's eye. I won't go into the details of it, but synesthesia is a fascinating condition which apparently a lot of artists have synesthesia. Now, using MEG, so the big hairdryer thing, we were able to show that people who have synesthesia, the parts of their brain that are responding to color are actually activated even when they're not seeing something in color. So those blue splodges you see at the back of the scan on the right hand side, those are areas of the brain which we know are activated when we see different colors in the visual world, but they were being activated when these synesthetes were hearing words like Wednesday, January, etc. On the left hand side we see the control participants, so these are people without synesthesia, and that splodge on the left hand side of the control brain, that is our auditory area, which is where we take incoming verbal language, and that's exactly what would happen with 98% of us. But with 2% of us, in addition to that area becoming activated, the area known for color is also being activated at the back, and this was done using this MEG. Another example here is using EEG, which is looking at the time course of events, and it's looking at how processing within the brain changes after you're looking at certain information. And this is rather complex information, but this is a study that I did years ago where we were comparing people who are average at face recognition and people who are called super recognizers, and we were able to see that if you just see those two images of the head, there's a lot more blue in the bottom right hand image than there is in the other one, which is for just regular average people, but the one on the bottom right is of a super recognizer, and all of that blue denotes that there's greater activity happening at different times. So the details aren't important, but it's just to show you that using this alphabet soup of brain imaging techniques, MRI, fMRI, PET, SPECT, EEG, MEG, etc., you can get all these different wonderful images of the brain doing different things. And over time, this has all come together. So many of you will have heard of the Human Genome Project, which was set up a couple of decades ago to try to map the human DNA sequence for us to understand the building blocks of life. Well, the Human Connectome project was developed more recently to try to understand the connections within the human brain and how everything is working when we see things, when we hear things, when we remember things, etc. It is nowhere near finished. It's in its beginning stages, but all the time there are wonderful new findings. And using information from neuroimaging, we hopefully over time will be better able to predict illnesses, illnesses of the nervous system. So, for example, one of the big things facing society, as I talked about in my first talk, was the massive increase in dementia across the globe, especially in the low to middle income countries, but even in the Western world we've got a massive growth in dementia. And what we see in the top panel, this is for control always means someone without the condition that we're studying. Baseline is studying someone at the start of a study, and then follow-up is a little while later. I don't know what the time span is. Oh, it's a three-year follow-up. So baseline on the left-hand side is the person's brain, and the follow-up is 3 years later. Now, if you look at the lower panel, that is for someone who ended up being diagnosed with MCI, which is mild cognitive impairment, and mild cognitive impairment is a precursor to the dementias. And the reason that this is important is that in this particular study by Mosconi and colleagues, which is rather old now, so they'll have got some even better results now. If you look in the top panel, just visually comparing the left and right, you see very little change in the 3-year gap, whereas further down for the person with MCI, there's a lot more of that dark green going on and a lot more of that blue coming in, and that is where they can start predicting that if someone's brain is changing like that over time, then that suggests that possibly there is signs of this mild cognitive impairment. That's rather technical, but the main thing is that by using these techniques, if they're used well, we can start predicting who might be developing these disorders, and then using that to help people in the future. So all of this is happening within a time frame, and what I wanted to give you is a sense of the pace of research in these areas. So in this graph on the x-axis along the bottom, I've got the year of publication of research, and I've started in 1967, the year of my birth. I thought that was a convenient point to start at, and along the y-axis on the left-hand side, it's the number of publications in what we call peer-reviewed journals. And peer-reviewed journals are publications where, rather than just anyone being able to get their work published in there, it is seen by experts who look at the work as objectively as they can, using quite strict criteria to decide whether something is robust enough to be published so that everyone else can read it. So these are peer-reviewed publications starting in 1967. So here we've got neuropsychology, and neuropsychology is possibly a bit older than neuropsychiatry. It depends on how you define the starting point. And what you see is that each year, in about 2006, that's when neuropsychology broke the 500 publications in a year mark. And now we're probably on about 700 publications a year, or 700 articles by different research groups a year published. For neuropsychiatry, which is the study of the disorders of the mental disorders, such as schizophrenia, it's a newer field, and so that's borrowing techniques from neuropsychology. And you see that even in 2018, 2019, it's only reaching about 200 publications. So that's the context for two of the neuros. This is Neuroscience. Now, what you see is that already by 2000, neuroscience publications had overtaken what neuropsychology is only getting to now, so about 700 publications in a year. And today it's nearer 4,000 publications a year. And this is, as I said earlier, neuroscience is a broad field, so there's a lot of different fields that are going into this, but it's a massive field and there's a huge amount of complexity. So that's all really good, because given that it involves anatomy, biochemistry, etc., there is going to be more. But an important thing to remember is that bigger does not necessarily mean better. And this is one of the problems in any research field which has really taken off, that there can be a bit of a chasing of the publications, and it's difficult to work out whether these publications and all of the findings are good or not. So this is what I want to do now in the talk. I'm going to move on to the fact that it's all great, but do we need to be careful? And there's three different things that I want to look at: neuromyths, the scientific principles behind the actual work that is being done, and then the use in society. So starting with the neuromyths, I mentioned these in my first talk. There's the 10% rubbish. So all of the time we're being asked, is it true that we only use 10% of the brain? Completely and utterly not. My standard reply to this is that we probably understand about 7% of the brain, and being a bit of an arrogant species, we've decided that maybe we're nearly there because we know 7%. There's probably only 3% to go. No, we only understand a very small amount of the brain, and when I retire, which I hope will not be for a very long time, the things that I am talking about now, and certainly the things that I learned as a student myself almost 30 years ago, will be like cave art, and that's because of the huge increase in our understanding. So no, we don't use just 10% of the brain. Then there's that old chestnut gendered brains, that male and female brains are different to one another, women's brains do very different things, etc., etc. Now, while there are differences between women's brains and men's brains, they're very subtle differences. They're nothing like these broad brush statements that are made a lot about male brains, female brains, etc., and these daft ideas, oh, so-and-so is very male brain. That's rubbish. And there's a book called Gender in Our Brains, how new neuroscience explodes the myths of the male and female minds, that if anyone is interested in, should look at. So a lot of this, there are fundamental differences, but they're small differences. They're nothing like the broad things people suggest. Then there's the left versus right brain. There are, yes, it is true that the left side of the brain, this hemisphere, tends to be quite analytic, and this side of the brain can be more creative. But the suggestion that someone is very left-brained or right-brained is again a load of rubbish. So there are some truths behind each of these points, but they're certainly not to the level where you can actually characterize someone as being a male brain or female brain or left or right brain. It just doesn't work like that. So those are just some very simplistic myths that abound in society, and they've been going for a long time and they'll keep going. What I want to now do is to move to the problems with neuroimaging, and the most important thing is that it's not what you think it is. Now, here on the left-hand side, I've provided you with some really lovely fMRI scans. So the fMRI scans are scans of the brain while someone is doing something. And what the people doing these studies are looking at is activity in different parts of the brain and seeing which parts of the brain become more active when if you're speaking. So we see that in the right hand side. If you're just tapping your fingers, middle one, and instead of speaking you're listening to someone. And you get these lovely scans where the hot colors like the reds and the yellows imply a lot of activity. And they're used all the time, and the buzz phrase is lighting up. Very importantly, and many of you won't know this, is that brain activity is not being measured. There is no direct evidence there that that's the brain being active. What's being done is that we're actually looking at oxygen flow. So any brain region that's doing a lot of work needs more blood which has got oxygen in it. Just like if you're running, your leg muscles and your thorax need oxygen carried by the blood to help it move the muscles, etc. In the same way, while your brain is active, if you're doing something that involves a lot of visual work, then the parts of the brain that are processing visual information, they will need more blood with the oxygen to allow them to function. So what's actually being seen here is blood flow. Now the blood flow does correlate with the brain activity, but it's not a direct thing. However, we know that blood flow is a reliable measure, but it's a slow response. So it's not the one-to-one mapping that is sometimes suggested by people. True brain activity only happens when the neurons communicate with one another, and they use these things called neurotransmitters, which are little messenger parcels, and they're best measured using electrodes and EEG, or that MEG thing, like the hairdryer I had on. But these methods are very limited and can't tell you where the signal is coming from and what the signal means. So neuroimaging is very complicated, and I don't know it very well myself at all, but it's remarkable, as you'll see as I proceed with the talk, how this lack of understanding is used and abused a lot, both within science and without science. An important problem is to do with the mathematics. Now, each scan, when you do an MRI scan, can cost up to $1,000. These costs are coming down all of the time, so it may be less than $1,000 now, but that's a lot. Now, early studies published papers with as few as 8 participants in them. We know from statistical perspective, because of the way that statistics work, for us to try to make any claims from the studies that we're doing, that 8 is far too few. Nowadays, they might have 20 to 30 people who were tested to create those lovely brain scans, but that's still not thought to be sufficient. So that's a big problem. And then the second problem is there's this huge problem with what we call replication. Because in science, just like when that apple fell on Newton's head, he didn't just stop there with saying, I think I've discovered something new, and let's call it gravity. After that, he replicated what he thought had happened many, many, many times with other things to try to get an understanding of this thing that he thought was this force that pulled the apple down to the ground. So in science, we always replicate to make sure that the first finding we had wasn't a complete fluke. And science can't proceed without sufficient replication. And yet what's being found in the neurosciences and the neuroimaging particularly is that a lot of these cool findings, and remember the graph with the 4,000 publications per year, a lot of the ones to do with neuroimaging are not being replicated. So that suggests that they're on shaky ground. Now, a number of problems are are involved. So, an MRI scan, it involves lots of little squares, just like your mobile phone or your SLR camera has got these things called pixels, which is basically how finely grained the photograph can be that you take from it. In a three-dimensional space, the pixel is called a voxel. So they're these tiny, tiny little cubes, and there are about 40,000 in a typical scan, so that you've got very tiny little cubes that are being used for these brain scans. Now, because of the mathematics involved, and I'm not going to go into it, you can end up with 40,000 separate comparisons that are happening. And there's a major problem in what we call the multiple comparisons problem. Because basically, if you've got 40,000 comparisons that can happen, just completely by chance, and not because there's anything real happening in those brain scans, you'll get a couple of those looking like there's something significant going on. And in science, we call those false positives, and that's where you cry wolf when there's not actually any basis for the finding at all. Now, the last couple of points that I've made have been quite technical ones, so apologies if your head is hurting from it, but I'll be able to demonstrate these points with the dead salmon. Yes, I do mean a salmon. This came about because of a study that young men were doing, and they found something rather interesting. And this is from the poster that they presented at a conference. And in our posters and the work that we publish, we have to talk about who our subjects or participants are and what the task was, how we analyze the data, etc. And here they said that their subject was one mature Atlantic salmon that participated in this fMRI study, and it tells us the dimensions of the salmon and helpfully that the salmon was not alive at the time of scanning. The task administered to the dead salmon involved completing an open-ended mentalizing task where it had to think. The salmon was showed a series of photographs depicting human individuals in social situations with the specified emotional valence, so things that are happy or sad, funny, etc. The salmon was asked to determine what emotion the individual in the photo must have been experiencing. Now, of course, this is all very silly, but they were trying to make a point of this particular in this particular study. Now, the salmon was dead. Now, even if it was alive, it would have been a very clever salmon to understand the English for what was being done, in terms of you're going to see some photographs. If you see someone who looks happy, then press this button. If you see someone who looks sad, press that button. So it would have had to be a really clever salmon, even if it was alive, to be able to do this task. And this task was being developed for using with human people who would be alive at the start, at the point of doing the studying. But they wanted to demonstrate something, and what they found was this. Those little red dots in the middle of that scan in the middle, so that's the salmon's head at the front, those are where the salmon's brain is. And the red dots are where there's a lot of activity apparently going on. Now, what this shows us is that there's a dead salmon who was somehow responding to human English sentences about emotions, and parts of its brain were responding to these sentences. Of course, that's a load of rubbish. There's nothing happening in the salmon's brain, but the reason that they got these little blobs is because of all of the mathematics involved in this type of neuroimaging, which can result in these completely spurious and completely meaningless findings. Now, good neuroscience and good neuroimaging will make sure that they take care of these, all of these problems, but it's not necessarily the case. And this is happening everywhere because of the pressures on scientists to publish work, to get research grants, etc., there is a real pressure to publish things with cool results. And so sometimes you can end up with findings like this with humans, and in this case the fact that the scan doesn't look like a human would have been a bit of a clue that there was something fishy going on here. But if I showed you a human skull with that, you wouldn't have questioned it. So we've got to be very careful. So the dead salmon is a real warning to us. The next thing is that seeing is believing, and this is about the power of an image of the brain. In this study, what McCabe and Castell did was that they made up, and this is a completely made up study because they wanted to test something. They made up a study which suggested that watching TV makes you better at doing arithmetic. And they said that the reason for this is that the part of the brain which is for watching TV, which is kind of along these parts of the brain here, is the same part of the brain that is useful for when we add up numbers, do multiplication, etc. So what they were saying is that when you watch TV, it's exercising the same part of the brain that you need when you're doing maths. And what they did is that they had two groups of people. One group of people, both groups of people were given exactly the same paper with all of the explanation, etc. There was only one difference between the two papers. Sorry, the two groups. One group got the bar graph, which is on the left, where it shows, they said, the particular part of the brain called blah, blah, blah. This is activation in that part of the brain, and what it's suggesting that orange bar is the same as the red bar, and therefore when you watch TV it's the same activity as when you're doing maths. The second group got the image on the right hand side, which shows the brain and these red splodges just like on the salmon. And what they did is that they asked people who did the study to say how accurate they thought the paper sounded. So both groups had got exactly the same wording of the research paper explaining what it did, etc. One group got the bar graph, the other group got the brain image. Otherwise the text, etc. was exactly the same. And what you see here in the graph on the bottom right hand is that the people who saw the brain image, the paper version with the brain image, they gave much higher ratings for how accurate this science was. They said that this science made a lot of sense because they saw a brain image attached. Whereas when the people who saw the bar graph that you see there in the middle, they gave much lower ratings of how believable this research was. And so what this suggests is that if I say anything to you or I write anything for you, if I plonk an image of the brain next to what I'm saying, then you're likely to believe it. And years ago when I did work for TV interviews, I tend to have a brain scan behind me because I knew that the producers wanted a brain scan to legitimize everything I said. Even though I didn't even point to the brain scan or mention it, anything like that, having a brain scan behind me suddenly made the words that I was saying much more accurate and believable. And this was taken to a lovely level with this study on neuroenchantment. And in this study, which I think is wonderful, they got students to take part in this study where they were taken into a room and sat in that chair, and they had that computer monitor showing images of the brain. And you can see what it says here. It says the mock neuroimaging device assembled from discarded odds and ends, including a scrap salon hairdryer. So this, unlike my MEG image earlier, this was a hairdryer, and it wasn't a brain image, a brain scanner. They just used various boxes, and they'd use an old TV screen. And it says that throughout, and what the participant was told was that their brain was going to be imaged, and they had to make some ratings about it. And it says throughout the mock scan, a pre-recorded video displayed rotating three-dimensional brain slices with accompanying scanner-like audio, lending the appearance of collecting and analyzing patterns of the brain, of brain activity. And participants were asked to say how much they agreed with the science that was happening here. And what they found is that even students who'd studied neuroscience and who'd been told to be careful about some of the claims made from neuroscience were believing that this scrap salon hairdryer and these odds and ends were actually able to look at their thought patterns. And this is the quote which I love, which portrays brain imaging as an omniscient strategy for unscrambling the neural correlates of thought. Fueled by popular media and lay accounts, Neuroenchantment further blurs fact from fad and leads to accepting tentative suppositions as indisputable fact. Even participants explicitly educated about the limits of neuroimaging succumb to our simple trick, albeit less. And so what I think is that there is a real emperor's new clothes thing going on here. And this is why I rail against the neuro-bollocks, that of course neuroimaging is damn useful, and it's got its uses and it's got its strengths, etc. But the problem is that the people who are using it appropriately are possibly in the minority. And often what happens is that even when there's evidence to suggest that what is being demonstrated is not accurate, people will still believe it. So that leads me to how, that was just in science because these were science students, but now we're talking about how it's misused in society. And in society, we've got people who are prey to a lot of the claims that are made without any real basis to the claim, to the marketing that goes behind some products. So this is something from an American judgment, which was for a company called Luminosity, and they were made to pay $2 million to settle a claim for a brain training program, because basically it had been found that there just wasn't the science behind what they were claiming. But you have all these people who've got older relatives who they think are having problems with their memory, etc., and they are sitting ducks for companies like this who are trying to market products that claim to improve people's brains. This is a quote from the director of the FTC's Bureau of Consumer Protection, which is that Luminosity preyed on consumers' fears about age-related cognitive decline, suggesting their games could stave off memory loss, dementia, and even Alzheimer's disease. But Luminosity simply did not have the science to back up its ads. So the problem here is that people hope that they've found something that they can give to their parents or loved ones to improve their memory, etc. But usually all that these brain trainers are doing is getting people to be better at those brain trainers and nothing else. Now this has also appeared in education, and I know that there's various people out there who are watching this, such as people from my choir, such as Debbie, Liz, Heather, etc. And I think you'll all be aware of this, that in 2005, at the launch of the Centre for Neuroscience in Education in Cambridge, teachers reported receiving more than 70 mail shots a year, encouraging them to attend courses on brain-based learning. So there's this real kind of like, yes, there's all these packages that you can do which are backed up by science about the brain. And teachers are advised to ensure that their classroom practice is automatically left and right brain balanced to avoid a mismatch between the preference of their learners and their learning experience. And you remember what I said earlier about left and right brains. And teachers were often told that kids should be identified as verbal, auditory and kinesthetic, and encouraged to adopt a commercial brain gym package. And this is from Ben Goldacre, who used to write for the Guardian newspaper, and he's a trained doctor who writes a lot about bad science. And apparently there was an interview of someone involved in creating the brain gym, and it was hilarious, but I haven't been able to find the paper, unfortunately. But here are examples of the things that the brain gym told these teachers to tell their kids to do. So they were to make a C shape with their thumb and forefinger and place either side on the breastbone just below the collarbone, and gently rub for 20 or 30 seconds while placing other hand over their navel and changing hands and repeating. Apparently this exercise stimulates the flow of oxygen carrying blood through the carotid arteries to the brain to awaken it and increase concentration and relaxation. And they're also told to drink a glass of water before brain gym activities, as it is a major component of blood. Water is vital for transporting oxygen to the brain. This is all complete and utter bollocks. Now, what's found is that that's the way things are being marketed to teachers, but research has shown that even when teachers are being trained, they are really susceptible to neuromyths. And this is a study done by two Germans where they looked at trainee teachers, and they looked at what percentage of them believed that there were different types of learning styles, the effectiveness of the brain gym that I've just told you about, etc. So these are all popular myths that occur in the neuroscience and education world, and you can see that some of them are believed by 90-odd% of these trainee teachers, and they found that it didn't actually matter whether someone was a trainee or actually qualified. You still ended up with people believing them a lot. So this is a quote, which is that teacher education does not seem to be able to successfully professionalize students' misconceptions about learning and memory. And this is a paper from 2019, so just last year. So the findings that I'm talking about aren't old things, they're happening all the time. And this is because as soon as you put the term neuro or brain next to a statement, then people start believing it, and we've got to be careful about that. I'm nearly done now. Now we're moving into public policy. This is from, I think it was the Telegraph, and it shows two brain scans, and the heading says, what's the difference between these two brains? They both belong to 3-year-olds, so why is one so much bigger? Because one was loved by its parents and the other neglected, a fact that has dramatic implications. Now, this is a load of bollocks. There's so much wrong with this statement. The mere fact that they've made one image 2/3 the size of the other image is the reason that one is bigger than the other. It's got nothing to do with neglect. But it resulted in Graham Allen and the great Ian Duncan Smith, one of our conservative politicians, in a 2010 collaboration called Early Interventions, Good Parents, Great Kids, Better Citizens, to say neuroscience can now explain why early conditions are so crucial. And then Andrea Leadsom, another conservative MP, these are all people who've tried to become Prime Minister of this country. She was part of a conference called Two is Too Late, and papers such as 1001 Critical Days. Now, the reason that this is important is that these are people from the conservative right who were using these findings to try to push certain public policies to do with children's adoptions, or whether their mothers could keep their kids beyond a certain point if they couldn't look after them, etc. Now, the ins and outs of that are extremely complex, and of course children should be looked after, but their policies should not be affected by bad science. There's absolutely no details on the case study that is in that image there, except for the fact that one had extreme neglect, and that we know that the child was in a Romanian orphanage. There could be lots of other things, ranging from malnutrition to a disability. And if I've done research on single cases, but I spent 5 years studying one person before I published a case on that person. I wouldn't have done it just on the basis of one brain scan. And this is an example of how these people have taken something that has been published badly and then used it to try to drive their particular social agenda, and that is unforgivable. Now, Sue White, who's a professor of social work at the University of Birmingham, is very skeptical of what she's called the artfully packaged neuroscience or early intervention narrative. And so that is part of the kind of things that Ian Duncan Smith and Andrea Loathsome were doing, where they were trying to package this neuroscience into something to do with early interventions in children's rearing. And finally, Eamon McCrory is a professor of developmental neuroscience at University College London, said neuroscience has incredible potential to shed new light on a long-standing problem. It can play a key role in helping us uncover mechanisms of vulnerability linking early adversity and increased lifelong risk of mental and physical health problems. But it is not a privileged level of explanation. So what he's saying here is that yes, neuroscience is really useful. It is able to uncover important things, but it's not a privileged level of explanation. And the point behind this is that often what we find, even within science, and I've seen this in my own career, that as soon as someone has something neuroscientific, such as a brain image, that means that we may as well just chuck everything else away, because apparently we've now got enough, and that is completely and utterly not the case. I'm finally going to talk about some of the absolute rubbish that goes on in the outside world, even away from these bloody conservative politicians, etc. Here is an advertisement for a conference called Neurobusiness 2015. Join some of the world's leading neuroscience experts as they explain the benefits of neuroscience for business. Okay, and it was well attended. You see lots of people there, and very conveniently there are brain images. Okay, so it's a shame I can't see you all, but let's imagine that I asked you to guess the total number of neuroscientists that were invited to speak at Neurobusiness 2015, where you're going to join some of the world's leading neuroscience experts. How many neuroscientists? This many. Not a single neuroscience scientist was invited to this conference. And here are some tweets that came out from the conference. Hack your brain's dopamine to become addicted to success. Men's brains fire back to front, women's from side to side. That's why women multitask so well. So, men are going this way, women are going that way, and, that's all you need to know about men's and women's brains. Apparently these tweets got out, and so people in the neurohacking world who know what rubbish this is started making up tweets, and it took the conference a little while to realize that they'd really boo-booed. The final thing I'm going to talk about is called neuro overcompensation. This is from an advert selling Porsches, and it had a gentleman who drove a Porsche and also then went and flew a jet, and we want to see what's happening in their brains.
Let's look at the results. This is Jeroen's brain activity in the Porsche, and here This is brain activity collected in the fighter jet. As we can see, the dopamine levels are higher in the jet. However, overall there are clear similarities. For example, in both images, we can see the excitement centers lighting up.
Based on the results, taking a hard left in a Porsche is actually comparable to taking a hard left in a fighter jet.
You can see why I've called this neuro overcompensation, because anyone who believes that complete claptrap about the excitement levels from the flying a fighter jet being the same as doing a turn or whatever it is in a Porsche does deserve to be separated from their money. But this is the kind of rubbish where putting neuro in front of something will result in your product being much more valuable, apparently. So, to summarize, the neuros are a very complex and growing family, and that's great. There's great work being conducted around the world by both researchers and clinicians to help us understand human behavior and to help improve lives. And just today I met someone in the supermarket, Richard Killick, if you're listening to this, who is working on Alzheimer's but also working on COVID at the moment. So neuroscience is helping enormously to try to deal with many of the issues that we're dealing with in society. However, there's also a lot of misunderstanding of the power of the neuros, and that emanates both from within science, with some bad practices, and even the students who are being taught are being allowed to go out into the outside world with these huge misconceptions, including the teachers. So there's a lot of stuff going on there that we need to be careful about. And then, of course, some of this is being used inappropriately without any understanding, and sometimes that's abusive, sometimes it's just downright stupid, and sometimes it's abusive. So it is being also used to part people from their money because of this neuro-bollocks, and we've got to be very careful about that. So the point of this lecture wasn't to go into the details of what neuroscience and neuropsychology is, but to give you a warning about some of the things that can happen in this particular field. So I hope that has been at least somewhat informative and educational. So finally, I'll just tell you about our studies that I've mentioned in previous talks, that my group does research on different brain recognition disorders, memory and amnesia, dementia, stroke rehabilitation, and what are known as the executive functions. And if you're interested in hearing anything about these the research projects that we're involved in, then please do get in touch with my assistant Claudia Pulcini at c.pulcini@gov.ac.uk. I'd like to thank you for your patience in listening to this, and if you're tweeting, then do tweet about it. The next talk will be the one about the brains of the brain, which is basically involved in everything to do with childhood development, challenges during adolescence, the problems of addictive behaviors, our decision making, the aging process, and even the impact of drug therapies for some forms of cancer. So that will probably be this time next Saturday. Okay, so I've got some questions coming in. So the first question is from Felicity. She asked whether people with synesthesia see the same colours for the same sounds. It's a very, very good question. So synesthesia, which is multisensory perception, is a very, very interesting condition and quite what we call heterogeneous in terms of how people differ to one another. So a classic form of synesthesia is called grapheme phoneme synesthesia, where people either see words or hear words in color. And the classic ones are days of the week, letters of the alphabet, and months of the year, etc. And what we find is that there's huge differences between synesthetes. So if I had two synesthetes in front of you here, one of them would say Monday is blue and Tuesday is pink, and another one might say Monday is actually red and Tuesday is yellow. So they do differ from one another, and we don't know why. There are some patterns, but the patterns are pretty broad. So synesthetes do differ from one another, and there's lots of different types of synesthesia. Some are more rare than others. So the coloured grapheme, so seeing words in colour, is a more common one. Another one is seeing musical keys in colour. Some people have what's called space-time synesthesia, where they actually visualize years around them in a circle or in a visual space around them. There's also here the music one is quite an interesting one, because I heard someone once say that they didn't realize that that we don't all have synesthesia, because most people think that, like most of us, that, oh, I'm just like everyone else. And apparently this synesthete thought that the reason that the lights are turned low at a concert when it's about to start is so that everyone can see their colours better, because this person knew that when the music started, the blues and the reds and the greens that he could see when he listened to music, they became just sharper colours, and he assumed that this was the case for everyone. And it was only when someone said, what the hell are you talking about, that he realised that he had something a bit different. There is a big preponderance of synesthesia in artists. So Nabokov, various composers, Chopin, etc., were synesthetes, David Hockney. So there has been a questioning of whether synesthesia goes with the creative mind, but there isn't any certainty. So Jane Antoinette Croucher asks, is there any way to train your brain and guard against deterioration, for example, learning a foreign language or a musical instrument? It's an interesting question. Generally speaking, one of the things we think about the brain as is it's like a muscle, and we refer to the use it or lose it hypothesis, which is that if you use it to its best advantage, you can keep it functioning better. And there is enough evidence that keeping mentally active is really good for keeping the brain going. So those things about about activities such as other languages and musical instruments, that may help. I don't know any hard evidence about that, but I think it's the case that people who have second languages might suffer deterioration a bit less because they're using the brain a bit more than a monolingual, but please don't quote me on that. From my second talk, so part 2 of the why do we know less about the human brain one, I talked about mindfulness meditation and how mindfulness meditation seems to be quite good for staving off some of the thinning of certain parts of the brain that are involved in attention and perception. So there is some evidence. It's not a one-to-one mapping, so it's not the case that learning a language is going to stop brain deterioration, but certainly keep going. Okay, so Marek's question. Hi Marek. Are the political differences shown at the start, is it known if those preferences were there because of the differences in the brain, or did the different outlooks cause the differences? Well, that is a classic chicken and egg issue. We have no idea. You need a longitudinal study where you brought someone up in isolation and you brought them up with certain either right or left-leaning politics to see, which is never going to happen. So we have no idea. It's the classic nature-nurture argument, and we really don't have enough information to know that. So I'm afraid I don't know. I imagine that it's probably more a learned behaviour than something that was there at the start, but that is just a supposition. Now, the main thing about this talk isn't that I think neuroscience is bad, because of course I use neuroscientific techniques myself. The main thing is just to be aware of it and not to blindly agree with everything. And in fact, this is one of the things that's happening in society a lot. We have issues about people's political literacy, people's financial literacy, in terms of understanding what's being told us by our politicians, or how to be careful about our money, etc. And all I'm saying here is to be careful about the types of thinking that you have, or questioning when someone tells you something, that just because it says neuro in front of it does not make it better. And there's a good likelihood that they're talking complete rubbish, and they're using the fact that a lot of people are gullible. So I think that's my main message. Not that it's all rubbish, it's just be careful. Oh, here's another one. Phil, you didn't need to write a whole essay here. We've recently become more cynical about experts, such as 2008 crash wasn't foreseen by financial experts. The current government is using science and experts to defend its measures against COVID, but refusing to share the details. Is this the equivalent of showing the picture of the brain in the background, and we're just as gullible? Actually, that's a very, very good question. I have major issues with the way that the government is using or informing us about what's happening. I, of course, don't know anything about COVID itself, but I find it interesting that we have a government which includes someone like Michael Gove, who famously told us that we'd had enough of experts during the referendum, when the scientific experts were telling the scientific experts, the financial experts, etc., were telling the public that leaving the EU was going to be a complete and utter bloody disaster. And he told us not to listen to the experts because we'd had enough. But now these same people are saying that we're being led by the science, but we're not hearing what that science is. We hear little scraps, but we're not told what those things are. And there's a kind of patronizing, infantilizing aspect of that, as if to say, no, little people, you don't need to know, just trust us. Well, that's one thing I certainly do not do. So I do think that what's happening, as Phil points out, is that phrase, we're being led by the science, is being used as a smokescreen. It's being used to tell Joe Public, and Joanne Public as well, that it's okay, we know what we're doing. But I think there are enough examples of what's happening and what's not happening to suggest that actually there is a bit of sleight of hand going on, because we certainly don't know what these scientists are telling them. So yes, I think there is a bit of a parallel there, that there is a bit of a smokescreen there, with the idea that just saying that we're being led by the scientists or the science is as if to say everything I'm saying is completely correct, and we know that that's not the case. So I think that given that COVID has brought us together, I think that's a very good way to finish off now. So I will love you and leave you. I hope that this finds you well, and maybe you will tune into the next talk.